Hello, my name is David Worthington. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to use Visual Studio Load Test Agents to load test Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015. In this video, we will create a private test lab with a test controller and 5 test agents, and then run a 250 user load test against Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015. This diagram here is an example of what a test lab would look like, in this case connected to a Team Foundation server with a controller and, well, in this case the 4 agents and a separate database server connecting to some test target, which in this case is a web application, just like the Microsoft Dynamics NAV web client. So it's very similar to what we're setting up here. So, why would you want to set up your own test lab? If you recall, in the earlier video about load testing using Visual Studio Online, I talked about the difficulty and the expense of creating your own test lab when compared to using Visual Studio Online. However, there may be some good reasons why you want to do this. The first one is that your application is running on a private network and you don't have the possibility to expose it to test agents running in the cloud. There also might be some special configuration you need to do for the test agents. For example, if you had some sort of special certificates that they needed to have installed on them in order to be able to connect to your server. Another reason might be that you needed special hardware to test on and you didn't have control over the hardware that the agents in the cloud are running on. And finally, you might want to test with different network configurations, and again, you wouldn't be able to control that in the cloud situation. So all of these are good reasons why you might want to set up your own test lab, but you should certainly consider using Visual Studio Online unless you've got specific needs. So what are the prerequisites for doing this? Well, firstly, you need to have Visual Studio 2013 Ultimate to create and run load tests. You'll need Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015, and for this demonstration I'm using the demo image with the web client, and it's set up on running on Windows, Azure and virtual machine. You'll need a NAV license that allows you to run multiple concurrent users, and I'm using 250 concurrent users in this, but you'll need to configure the test to as many users as your license allows. And importantly here, you'll need to install the agents for Microsoft Visual Studio, and the installer, which you can find on the Microsoft download site, has both the agent and controller installer. We'll look at that in the demo. And finally, you'll need machines to install the agents on. In this test, I'm using 5 different test agents. And like all the other videos, you'll have to have watched the previous videos, particularly that about simulating users when load testing Microsoft Dynamics NAV, to understand the changes we've made in the NAV load test solution. So these are the steps we're going to go through today. Firstly, configure a test controller, and then we'll configure the test agents to connect to that controller. We'll configure our load test to use the controller, and then to demonstrate we'll run a load test where we'll test NAV with 250 concurrent users distributed across those agents. So the first step is to install this test controller. So after you've downloaded the ISO image from the Microsoft download page, so the setup screen, once you've run the controller installer off the DVD, it'll install the controller and then it'll present you with this configure test controller page. And the configure test controller page will have settings for what account you're going to be running. Typically, if you're running in a domain, you will use a domain account. So the servers, all the machines that are in the domain can communicate across the network using that account. If you're running in a workgroup, you may need to set that up differently and have a special account. So there's a lot of guidance on the MSDN site for how to configure security for load test labs in different configurations. And you need to select the controller, and so you'll register with Team Foundation Server if you're using Team Foundation Server. And finally, for load testing, you need to configure the database to store the results in. Now, if you're running, as we have been in the previous demonstrations, with Visual Studio, really you're just using a local controller in Visual Studio, but you're not able to connect to other test agents. So the difference here is the machine that you're running on is now also the controller of multiple agents. And you configure the settings there as well as the installer. So once you've done that, you're able to actually manage the controller in Visual Studio. So in Visual Studio, when you're looking at the load test, you have a little toolbar here saying Manage Test Controllers. And up until now, when you've looked into that, you'll just see local controller and the database connection for the load test results store. So once you have an installed a controller on your network, you'll be able to go and select it here. It'll detect it and connect to that controller. And as you can see here, it's already finding the agents that have been installed. And we'll go to our next step, which is setting up the agents. So again, on each agent machine, you have to run the installer, and the installer will again ask you to configure the agent. And in this case, it's just being able to give the username that you've decided to use, the service account, and the password, of course. And then there's other options as well you can set up for running agents interactively, but we don't need to run interactive agents here as we're running against a service. And finally, you need to register with the test controller, and you'd be connecting the default port here, which is this 6901 port, which was set up by default when I installed the controller. So that's all there is to do to configure the test agent. As I showed before, when you go into Manage Test Controllers, it'll actually show the agents that have been configured. So the next step is to configure our load test, and as we've done previously, we get the load test solution from GitHub and open the solution. In this case, we'll be configuring as previously to use the NAV user password authentication against our remote server. The next thing to do is now create a test settings to allow tests to be remotely executed. On our test controller machine in our solution, I've added a new test settings file here, which I called agent load test settings. And when you set that up the first time, you choose here in this drop down to do remote execution rather than default, which would have been local execution. And you need to check that you can connect to your controller here, and I've brought up the same controller that I showed you before. And here, if you need to have special configuration for different agents, you can set up roles here. I don't need to set up any roles here because I'm just using all the agents for the same role, which is to run the test. You can also configure here what diagnostics to collect from the agent. In this case, I'm just collecting system information from the agent. So the reason for distributing the load like this is probably not so much for what we're doing here is with a few hundred users, but if you really want to scale out to maybe 500 users, then you'd need, on a large NAV instance or multiple instances, then you would get to a point where it was hard to simulate the load on an individual controller. You'd need to distribute it out to multiple agents. So this is really when you want to scale up your load to many users. Normally you can monitor the local machine and see, well, is the performance of the agent limiting the amount of test throughput that we're trying to get to achieve that. So if we'll just apply those settings now and close it, but the important step here is now to make sure that you've set the load test settings, which are defined as remote execution, to be the active load test and web settings. So this is very important if you've got multiple test settings, which you probably have by now, the setting that enables it for actually running the load tests. So in the actual load test definition file here, we have the settings that we've looked at before, and the relevant thing here is I've set that the agent count is 5, so I want to distribute my test across 5 agents, and the load pattern, which I'm going to be using today, is 250 users. That'll be 50 users across each. Now, in order to be sure that that's going to work, I have not created 250 unique users on my server. So because each agent is running in a separate process, it won't know about the users being created on other agents. There might be ways if you needed to do that, you would have to have some common database that the load test agents would communicate through in order to synchronize. But in this case, I'll allow each agent to create users 1 to 50 and running against the same tenant. But it's possible to make your test agents much more independent if you create a load test plugin. All the information about that is on the MSDN site about load testing using Visual Studio. So the next step after we've configured the load test to run is to run the load test. So before we run our load test, because we're running it remotely, I'm going to set up a performance monitor to collect the NAV performance data before I start the test run, and then once it's running we'll look into the server to monitor the active sessions. I've created a script here to see how many how many users are currently running, and if I just run that script, it's currently showing that there are only 2 users connected through a Windows client, and that's the 2 sessions I have available here connected to the default tenant. And you can see that the sessions list, there's currently no one else attached except my own user. I'll start up a NAV data collector set here to collect performance counters during the run. So the next thing is to go into our controller machine and start the run. And we'll let that run for a while, and then we'll come back and look at the results. Test controller here, we can see that as the active user count has been ramping up, and now it's reached 250 users and stabilized there. The response time we can see is also beginning to stabilize. I think initially there's a lot of load on the server as so many users are connecting at once, and we can actually see that on the server by the performance. Mostly IIS is using a lot of processor during the initial stage of the test. But the other difference here that you can see is that now you can actually monitor multiple computers here. So there's it's monitoring all the agents and the controller here. So let's switch to our NAV server, and we can now stop the data collector set, and we can have a look at the results there. And we should see a very colorful graph. And obviously the indicators here that are interesting are the active sessions, which we can see increasing up to the maximum of 252, because it also includes the 2 sessions that I created earlier in the web client. We can also see the amount of memory being used by the server increasing as users are added, but proportional to the number of users, and then once the users are connected and doing the same thing, there's very little change in the amount of memory being used. This is showing how many server operations are being executed. There's quite a lot when you've got 250 users. So this is just to show how the performance monitors built into NAV, as well as the system performance monitors, can give you a good picture of what's happening when a system like this is performing under heavy load. And as I showed you before, I have a little PowerShell script here just to check the number of active users. I ran that before, and now it's reached 252 and is stable there. So just to recap what we've been through today, the purpose of this demonstration was to show you how to set up agents and controllers. That's very easy, as you saw. You create a load test to use the controllers and the agents, and finally you start the load test. So once you've got the agents and the controllers set up, it's just about the same as running them on Visual Studio online. The difference here is there are a lot more possibilities for configuring the agents and the controllers to your requirements. So there's a few important resources here. Firstly, the link to downloading the agents for Visual Studio. There's a lot of MSDN links here about managing test controllers and setting up lab environments. As I mentioned, getting the security is an important part of getting the test agents and controllers set up right for your system. That's all for today, and this video was created in collaboration with the Training Center, Platan, and Microsoft. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you learned something today.